This is Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. Here's your host, Paul Shoemaker.
I want to welcome everybody today to the Rebuilders podcast, and I want to welcome my guest today, David Risher. He's a friend for a long time, and he's a wonderful leader, and I can't wait to have a conversation with him today about leadership for the decade ahead.
It's great to be here, Paul.
So it's awesome to be here with you today, Mr. Risher. I'm going to ask you something that I ask everybody on the show to just start it off. As you look at the decade ahead, for you, what is the personal leadership attribute that you think you're going to need the most, or you're going to need to build the most new muscle about?
Yeah, so I think when you look at sort of macro trends right now, and you sort of feel what's in the air around diversity, inclusion, listening to people who have points of view that are different from yours and inviting them into your world, that's going to play out at the leadership level at a level I don't think has ever happened before. You know, you look at everything from sort of the new pressure on boards to be more diverse. And by diverse, I don't just mean, have the one black guy. I mean, I don't mean that. I don't think anyone means that anymore. I think maybe in the 70s and 80s, that's what that sort of sounded like. I think now what it means is, getting people from authentically different walks of life, of course, different races, of course, different genders and so forth. But at the same time, really trying to be inclusive in the way you sort of populate your leadership team. And so if your leadership team looks different from the leadership team that people might have built 20 or 30 years ago, your style has got to embrace that as well. And you got to really be thoughtful about how you're not just putting them at the table, but really bringing them into the conversation in an authentic way. I think it's going to be a big change over the next 10 years.
So you're a guy that certainly, to me at least, represents some of those qualities. What are you going to have to change about yourself and how you think about how you approach yourself being a leader? Because I know some of that's baked into who you are. What is it you got to build that you don't sort of have right now?
So I might be a little lucky in that way, in that might be something that comes a little more easily to me than some, just because, as you're sort of alluding to, that's been a bit of my background over the years. But that's not to say, I don't have anything to learn myself. Look, as a leader, I've been thinking about this recently. And, when you're in your 20s and 30s, people sort of put you in a leadership position, and you think it has something to do with your amazing ideas and how kind of awesome you are, right? Because you're in your 20s and your 30s, and that's sort of the way you think about the world. When you're in your 40s and 50s, as I am now, you start to realize it's much more about bringing out the awesome in everybody else around the table. And really working hard at that, not just treating leadership as sort of a bunch of one-on-ones, but really as sort of building a team and really understanding what everyone brings to the table and so forth. And that's a lesson I really feel, in part because of my leadership of World Reader, where we're a worldwide organization. And in any meeting, I'll have someone from Kenya and someone from India and someone from Peru and someone from Barcelona and all the rest. And so when I look at my recent experience and I look at my own lifetime, which we can talk about separately, it might be an area where I've got, some things that I've already learned, but still, the idea of active listening, the idea of really pausing and making sure that the loudest person isn't the one whose ideas are sort of always, in the forefront. You're laughing, maybe because you're sometimes the loudest person, but anyway, and I am too, right? I mean, that's kind of our thing, but look, that's not the way. If you're inviting people, again, some of whom may be newer to sort of this, this environment, some of whom might be from, as I say, different cultures or might not have thought of themselves as in a position to be a leader in the past. I think you, as a leader, have to work, that much harder to listen more carefully and frankly, to sort of shut up more and hear them more.
You and I, at different times in our lives, definitely grew up in cultures where the loudest one in the room is the one that won.
Yeah.
So that is an adaptation. David Risher leads an organization today called World Reader. They are all about trying to help end illiteracy all around the globe. It's a combination of books, technology, and programs. First, they find the right books, and then they figure out which technology makes sense. And then finally, they bring all this learning to life through supportive programming in countries all over the world. It's amazing work. As you will hear from David's conversation with me today, his career has crossed paths with a few pretty famous names in the technology world. But I would tell you, even more importantly, listen for two things. how his upbringing shaped his leadership and his ability to lead in the world that we live in and how unique it is. And secondly, also listen for how important and how powerful working across all three sectors has become for him today in his leadership style. Let's get back to the conversation with David.
Listen, there's no substitute for just practice and for acknowledging that it's something you got to learn, right up front. I probably, I wish I had some magic soundbite to make, a person into a leader who could, who could sort of, integrate, different experiences and so forth. I'm not sure the world really works that way. I think the way it really works is you look in the mirror one day and you say, what skills do I have and what skills do I lack in the new world that I'm going in? Maybe not the ones that got me here for the last 10 years, but the ones I'm going to need for the next 10 years. And then you just sort of get to work. Yeah. And as I say, I think that the trick here is, you hear the call to hire a more diverse team and you respond to the call. That's great. Good news, you just completed step one. But now comes step two, which is, are you really going to build a team that makes the best use of all those people and really, kind of brings all those people into the organization and so forth. I think, again, when I look back at my experience, but unfortunately, this isn't an experience that other people can replicate. It just happens to be my own life. I was raised by an African-American guy and a white woman at a time, more by the white woman, more by my mom, because my parents got divorced. But in any case, when they got married, it wasn't legal in a lot of the United States for a black man and a white woman to get married. I grew up in this funny time in the 70s where, I'm not sure I kind of knew how to identify. Was I, the child of a black man? Was I the child of a white woman? What kind of racially, what was I? And people would ask me this question all the time, what are you? But maybe one of the benefits that gave me is a sort of feeling that multiple cultures are a thing. Yep. I would go over to, sort of extended family dinners on my father's side. My father's father was an undertaker. There was a big old sort of rambling family and it was sort of big meals and all this sort of crazy thing. I go to my mom's, my mom's mother's house, very quiet affair and very sort of, frankly, a little bit rigid and a little bit stuffy. That was my childhood growing up, and I had to sort of be comfortable in both. And so, you asked me for advice for others. You can't pick your parents, so it's not like that. But I think to a certain extent, looking back at your life and finding times when you sort of had to be both, you had to listen carefully, you had to sort of, walk that line. Maybe that'll provide inspiration for other people.
Well, what I hear from you, David, one thing I'll interpret out of that I like to hear is you were sort of fortunate to have a certain set of organic experiences in your life. But what you also said is that there's an intentionality about it.
Yeah.
Right. No matter what experiences you have that you're fortunate about, we've all got to make a decision at some point. I got to take inventory. This leadership stuff, it's experiential, but it's also something I can intend to get better at. So you're a guy that's at a certain point in life that's got a certain style of leadership. We talked about what you learned growing up. Along the way, in the corporate world, the nonprofit world, were there any people or particular experiences or role models that stood out for you that, boy, along the way, these were really important people for me that I learned a lot from? Does anybody stand out?
Sure. And absolutely. And what's interesting is they stand out for the things that I brought forward, and in some ways, the things that I've left behind.
Yep.
I was lucky enough to work for Jeff Bezos for a long time. In fact, I've been doubly lucky because I worked for Jeff Bezos for many years, and before that, worked at Microsoft where you and I met. And of course, neither you nor I directly worked for Bill Gates, but Bill's personality permeated the organization. Yep. And so Bill's management style, frankly, it's a very top-down management style. It's a sort of power over type management style, as other people kind of describe that. That was interesting, and it sort of worked well for them at a certain time. But if I come back to your question, really, Jeff Bezos probably had a more direct impact on me, in part because I worked more closely with him, but in part because he saw really the power of the organization and his leadership coming not from himself or the force of his personality, although it's very strong, but from the customer. And he talks about this all the time. And of course, you only have to read, any article about Jeff to hear this come up, but it's legitimate. He believed that fundamentally Amazon would only be a relevant, important, enduring company if it could figure out what the customer wanted and sort of he kind of channeled that. I took an enormous amount of sort of cues from having a North Star that was sort of out there, not just sort of you, but kind of this thing that kind of existed almost in the universe. And let's kind of orient ourselves along that. Now, Jeff also had incredibly high standards. He was, focused as like you wouldn't believe. He could, of course, also be a very difficult person. All those things are the sort of leadership characteristics that you hear about all the time from senior leaders like that. But really what I took away from him is this sort of single-minded focus on the customer, and letting that kind of almost inform the way that you interacted with your team, because it gave him something to think about beyond just, what does Jeff think, but rather what do customers think is frankly a much stronger way of leading.
So when you and I started at Microsoft together, I believe we had the same first boss. Her name was Dawn Trudeau.
Yeah.
And I will definitely say that if I had to look at, 2 or 3 people that influenced my leadership style over the years, Dawn was absolutely one for me. Today, she's a co-owner of the WNBA Seattle Storm, and they've won 4 world titles. Not bad.
Yes.
I'm just curious, when you look back on Dawn, is there anything that stands out that you remember learning from her?
She's an extraordinary person. And I mean that in a couple of ways. We were just talking about the Microsoft culture, right?
Yeah.
Sort of a top-down, frankly, kind of an alpha guy culture. If you sort of have to characterize
that.
That was not her, and that takes some real strength to be in an organization where that is the sort of dominant mode. And she, in this sort of framework of kind of power over, that wasn't her. She was much more sort of the power with type person, sort of the I'm gonna empower you. We're side by side on this. We're linking arms on this thing. We're tackling this thing together, rather than sort of the opposite. So yeah, no, she actually wasn't my first boss, but she may have been sort of the most interesting boss I had, for exactly that reason. She was sort of sui generis, I guess. So she was kind of her own person, and within an organization of such a strong culture, for her to say, I'm going to be successful in a different way, was just extraordinary. And I think really she's got fans, I think, in that company like few other people, because she kind of did it her own way.
Could not agree more. She is one of the people that has more people that would say she was my mentor.
Yes.
Right along the way. There's dozens of people that would say that. Step back with me. Let's go up the 30,000 feet for just a little bit. When I sort of think about the world around us and the degree to which media has splintered so spectacularly and negatively for the most part in the last 10 years, there's been so much technology progress, and yet in some ways the digital divide grows. We've lived through this amazing experience, horrible in a lot of ways, called COVID. Does the splintering of media, does COVID, does digital divide, does that make being a leader harder, or is it just a different context you have to adapt your skills to?
It makes being a leader harder, for sure.
Yep.
And part of it is, leadership. And again, I'm particularly thinking of sort of team leadership, because I that's one of the things I've really come to understand. And I've come to understand that that's really where the strength of leadership comes from. It's in building the team and seeing the things that the team can do that the individuals could never do. Well, so now look at what social media does, which of course makes it so easy for you to find your own bubble and stay in it, and find beliefs that reinforce the beliefs you already have, and sort of double down on them. That's the opposite of building a team, right? Building a team is about a shared belief. It's about a shared narrative. It's about what can we do together. It's about how can we sort of, convince ourselves that what we're doing as a group is sort of this kind of magical thing, this kind of, almost, this sort of, I can't even describe it. I don't have the words for it, but this kind of magical thing that comes together when we're all together. Technology can theoretically bring people together, and we all know the promise of it. But as a practical matter, it seems to split people apart, just as much as it brings people together, maybe more so. And so leadership then becomes, again, spending, more of your time, more of your energy, really in building that team mode, and saying, let's get out of our own bubbles and let's come together, as a unit. And now you're not just sort of fighting against inertia or whatever people might be going on in their lives, but in the 10,000 other pieces of noise that they're being exposed to, and that very, very, very almost magnetic pull towards, sort of things that you believe where you sort of reinforced in your own bubble.
Yep.
That's different from everybody else. So sort of it's a killer.
No, that's a great, very tangible way. I have never sort of quite described it that way. Because obviously when we show up at work, we are that person that we are 24/7, right? And if
Right.
in the other 16 hours of our day, we're spending our time with our tribe and in our silo, that can't help but influence the kind of person we show up to at whatever our work environment is.
It's exactly it. Yeah, you're the same person. I mean, now, hopefully, again, a leader can kind of bring you together
Yes.
and sort of bring you out of that mode and so forth. But it's you're starting from a little bit of a deficit.
This isn't the first time Dave and I've had a conversation about leadership and about trying to do good in the world. And one of the things that I really admire about David Risher a lot is the degree to which he's worked across all three sectors: private, nonprofit, and public sectors. So just real quickly for our listeners, could you just quickly sort of like walk us through that pathway, where you were in each of those three sectors, why you ended up in each of those?
Sure. I mean, super briefly, I graduated from business school, came to work at Microsoft. I was sort of attracted to Microsoft because of the technology and the innovation and the feeling that this is sort of the future. I wasn't really thinking public sector, private sector, what have you, but because I went to business school, it almost sort of stood to reason I was going to go into the private sector. And then left Microsoft to go to Amazon. There again, private sector, of course, people think about Amazon today in a certain way, but at the time it was just a tiny internet bookstore. And so to be clear, what attracted me to Amazon at the beginning was I could take two of the loves of my life, the technology that I'd learned at Microsoft and books, which I've been a reader all my life, and put them together. So it really was kind of that simple. But as I sort of, was in that mode, Microsoft and Amazon, very sort of intense, private sector mode, there was always a piece of me that sort of thought back to my 8th grade self and thought, what was it that I wanted to be when I grew up, in 8th grade? And honestly, if you'd asked me at the time, I would have said a teacher. Maybe working at a university level. I don't know, because I, aspired to big things, but still it was sort of in the teaching and education space. So I got the opportunity when I left Amazon, it was to really scratch that itch. I went to teach at the University of Washington for a couple of years. So that was sort of my move into kind of the public and kind of nonprofit sector through education. Taught at the University of Washington for a couple of years. Actually was lucky enough to be elected Professor of the Year, which was just a wonderful honor and a great sort of validation that the thing that I always thought I was going to like, I liked. I think that's why people liked me, because they could feel me, sort of liking it. So that was good, sort of think of that maybe as part two. And then through a sort of long series of events with my family and travel and so forth, this notion of World Reader, which is using, again, digital technology to get kids reading all around the world. And again, you can start to see some themes here, come through. That was really when I really sunk my teeth into being a nonprofit leader, not just a sort of teacher or someone kind of in the sector, but really being a leader. World Reader is now a 10-year-old organization. We've helped 16 million kids read. And along the lines, we've had to do work back with the private sector. Amazon and Microsoft are partners with it. With the public sector, governments are partners with us, of course, because governments have the responsibility of keep people educated. And of course, the whole nonprofit sector. So that's sort of been my journey.
Yep. It's so funny. I was going to say, I can see you as a high school teacher with a bunch of high school kids. I can't see you as a professor at a college, but I guess I was wrong about that. There's something about a tweed jacket and a pipe and all that stuff that, I guess I have in my head about a university.
You know what? I left the tweed at home.
Good for you. That's smart. So that cross-sector stuff, I like to call that cross-sector fluidity. And what that means is that somebody doesn't just sort of pop in and out of these sectors, but David's the kind of leader that I think can move across those with a lot of fluidness. And it's a fairly natural thing for him now. As you sort of look over your career and you look at, let's say, where you are now, where you want to go, how does that cross-sector experience, how does that fluidity across sectors, how does that help you as a leader?
I mean, first thing I say is I just want to double down on the idea. I think it's so important that people not get themselves sort of tracked into sort of the narrow and instead, sort of go broad. And I mean, before I answer your question, I'll just sort of make a quick observation. Every company right now, for-profit or nonprofit, is becoming a digital company. Every company has become a digital company. I'm on the board of the Barbara Bush Family Literacy Foundation. We just had a board meeting yesterday. Half the conversation was about how can we, a 30-year-old family literacy organization focused on adult literacy, how can we use technology to increase our scale and impact? That was the conversation. The examples are obvious. Netflix 20 years ago, you might have thought of as a sort of media company. Now it's a digital company that's all about using data to try to figure out what it is that's going to hook you, how much they should spend on their properties and so forth. So you have to be a computer scientist and a data scientist as well as everything else you are when you're running your company. So even just thinking in the for-profit area, cross-sector, I mean, man, you got to lean into it. Now, when you think about going between for-profit and nonprofit, for example, for-profit's got this beautiful characteristic of it, which is clarity of purpose.
Yep.
The profit motive, it focuses your mind. You know what I mean? And eventually, you sort of get big or at least successful, and the more of whatever it is you're doing, the more pens you're selling, or the more software you're making, or the more people you're signing up for your online platform, the more money you're making, and the more money you're making, the more you'll be able to invest in. And that clarity of purpose and that sort of flywheel that people talk about is so powerful. The nonprofit space, unfortunately, is more complicated. It's more complicated because, yes, you got to worry about the money. Otherwise, you run out of
you still got to make more than you spend.
You got to make more than you spend. Exactly right. But it's in the background, because what's in the foreground is your impact, and so you got to balance these two things. So what you want to bring people talk about nonprofits should be run more like for profits. It's kind of baloney. I mean, what they really mean is nonprofits. People would like nonprofits to have the same focus and the same energy and so forth. You can get that same focus, you can get that same energy, but frankly, you got to work twice as hard, because you got to figure out the money side, and you got to figure out the impact side, and you got to figure out how not to have them tear each other apart. When you go from the nonprofit side to the for-profit side, there the issue is, I'm just kind of repeating what other people are saying. More and more people are joining companies, not just because of, I want to make money, or not just because I like the guy I interviewed with or whatever it is, but because of the mission of the company. Even the for-profit company, man, for-profit companies, I think increasingly are going to be under pressure to find a mission that's bigger than just, increased value for shareholders.
They are.
Otherwise, they're not going to get the best employees. They're not going to, and even if they get some of the best employees are going to leave for the other companies that can actually satisfy their soul, as well as kind of run the business. So here I'm just saying what others have said before. I think there's, in the for-profit side, a lot to learn about the mission-driven nonprofit. And for the nonprofit side, there is a lot to learn about the focus from for-profits, but you have to understand the tools you've got are a little bit different. And frankly, of the two, I think nonprofit's harder.
Yeah. Bill Gates had some quote about that a few years ago that said he thought running a for-profit was hard, and he had no idea once he went and tried to run a foundation. I put some of that into the book number 2. Just a couple more questions before I let you go today, David. We just talked about sort of like new people coming into companies. So let's think about some of those 20-somethings that are landing in companies today in such a different context than you and I did, 20, 30 years ago. Yeah. If you had to share one or two pieces of leadership advice with sort of a 20-something emerging leader today, or if you wanted to refer back to the, that 1990s version of yourself, what would you tell them?
I'll go back to that notion of team. I think the first couple of leadership opportunities you get, again, you think you're getting them, and maybe you even are, because of your amazing individual contribution. And so I think back to myself, in my 20s and 30s, and I mistakenly thought that the job at that point, once I had a team to lead, was to sort of take, my own amazing ideas and sort of use these individual people as sort of executors of those amazing ideas that I had, and I thought that's kind of what leadership was sort of all about me and my great ideas. I've come to understand that is I'm not even sure that's a form of leadership. I just think that's a sort of default behavior that you kind of find yourself in when you're a kid and you don't know any better. Leadership turns out to be really looking closely at the team and saying, what does each one of these people have individually and then collectively that they've got that I don't? And so, so how can we collectively do something that none of us individually could do? there's sort of two notions in there, and I'm kind of combining both of them together. One of them is recognizing that everybody's got skills that you don't. And there's that sort of old saying of, you hire a company of small people, you end up with a very small company. If you hire a company of giants, you end up with an amazing organization. So there's this kind of notion. But then the second notion that I'm really putting in front of people is that the whole really can be greater than the sum of the parts. And if you really think about building that team, not just as a bunch of individuals, not just as 5 different one-on-ones I'm having where 4 other people happen to be in the room, but I'm kind of giving out assignments to people, which is sort of one mode, and instead saying, how are we going to kind of tackle this together? And I'm going to keep my mouth shut and let you guys talk a little bit about it and try to figure out how we're going to get this done together. It's just a much more powerful model.
Yep. Amen to that. There is, I think, a piece of that you do just have to sort of learn by being in that situation and realizing that you thought you could get something done on your own. Actually, I can't. I need a whole bunch of people to do it with me.
Yeah, well, exactly. Look, the fundamental paradox, and I've actually heard Barack Obama talk about this notion of holding two kind of opposite, points of view in your mind at the same time. The fundamental paradox is, of course, it is about you in some small way, right? For whatever reason, someone decided, or you were in the right place at the right time, whatever it is, that you're sort of the leader. Fine. So it's a little bit about you, but it's only a little bit about you. It's much more about the other people. And that's really that's the fundamental shift that gets you out of your own way and allows you to unlock much more.
Yep. So last question, David, when you look at leaders around us and sort of the state of leadership, we have this amazingly challenging decade ahead of us. Yeah. When you think about leaders and leadership, do you feel hopeful? Do you feel skeptical? Where are you sort of at on that continuum?
You know what? I'm not sure where I am on hopeful versus skeptical. I know I am just so deeply curious about it. And here's what I really mean. We're about to have, I think, one of the most vivid case studies in leadership style that sort of the modern world has ever seen. You look at the sort of the Trumpian leadership style, and that's a very clear style. You may like it, you may not, but there's 70-some million people who think he's got something going on. That is a power over. You sort of have an image of it in your mind, and probably the image you have and the image I have probably isn't that different.
Yep.
Now then you look at the style that Joe Biden brings to the table. That is a very different style. That is a style of empowerment. That is a style of surrounding yourself with people who are brighter than you are. That is a style of power with and power to, not power over. That is that is a global style, not a sort of nationalistic style. I don't think you could come up with two people, who are so far apart, both of whom have the same job, one right after the other. So, which one wins? Look, I know which one wins. Long term, it's the second of the two. Long term, there's no question. Over the long term, the world is getting smaller. We got to work together. I mean, these things they're cliches, but they're also true. The long term, that works. But holy cow, we're going to get to see over the next little bit, in the sort of short and medium term, as we finish up this crisis, and as we see this sort of change in power, we're going to see which one motivates people, in certain ways. And I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating.
I never thought about that. We're about to see one of the most amazing leadership case studies of all time.
Absolutely.
You and I end up having a reason to talk every couple of years.
Yeah.
And every time I do it, genuinely, it's so invigorating. I love it. And I feel like every time we do it, when we pick up right where we left off. I don't know. In 2022, we'll have some other reason to talk again. And it'll feel like we just talked again yesterday. So I just want to tell you, thank you so much for your time and for sharing with us what you've learned and about leadership. You are a special leader.
Thank you, Paul. I feel exactly the same way. And I can't wait for it to share whatever it is we're going to learn in the next years and figure out where the world is at that point. It'll be fantastic.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, man. You take it easy. Thanks for your time and all you're doing.
Thank you for listening to the Rebuilders Podcast. For more information, resources, and episodes, visit paulshoemaker.org. That's paulshoemaker.org.